Hello, welcome to this ITWeb TV episode or this session. We are at the ITWeb Security Summit. This particular segment is brought to you in partnership with Snowed. In studio, I have Craig Lindsay. He is the head of IT and IT consulting at Bidvest Advisory Services. Craig, how's it? Craig, just to hear from you in terms of, some of the overlooked risks in cloud native environments, wouldn't you say those are, and, how do they pose a challenge in terms of, the threat detection and response?
Yeah, so in your cloud native environments, a lot of the overlooked responses and that happen to be on your third party risks. So your underlying cloud providers and the vendors obviously make up a lot of your cybersecurity skill sets, and they end up doing a lot of the monitoring, etc. So obviously the detections and responses end up falling on them. And if they obviously don't have the capabilities or any of those sort of things, that poses a big risk to the business. Your other risks is also configuration. So obviously, if you incorrectly configure something in the cloud, that is public facing, that is exposed across the entire public web, and therefore obviously can be exploited. And that is a big challenge and a risk. Because a lot of vendors don't necessarily know how to set up cloud correctly, or don't have the appropriate skill sets within whichever cloud you obviously end up picking.
Actually, another of the CISO who was sat here earlier also mentioned the configuration part that you just spoke to now. But just to hear from you again about what are some of the common myths then around cloud security that you could and that.
There are quite a number of myths.
Maybe the top three.
So I think the biggest one, especially in South Africa, that's maybe less prevalent overseas, is by default, if you move to cloud, you're suddenly more secure. And that everyone seems to think because it's suddenly not your problem, where in fact it is actually more your problem because you now have the vendor, obviously, underlying this. As well as if you make a mistake, it's public, it's very accessible to the attackers. It's not like your old traditional, you have a perimeter network, you can secure the perimeter. And if you make a mistake internally, it's less of a risk because unless they breach your perimeter, your risk is minimal. In cloud, any mistakes you make are public. And that's your biggest challenge. And that's also why the biggest myth is that you move to cloud, you're suddenly secure, you're suddenly not your problem. It's moved on to other people. So I think that's the biggest myth. And the other myth is knowing what you actually want in the cloud. People make mistakes in terms of where are the cost savings from a cloud perspective. And they seem to think that cloud is expensive. So usually the myth is very much that it's a very expensive enterprise and going cloud is going to cost you a lot of money. A lot of people forget your operational costs, your actual overheads, your actual servers. They tend to just go, we got a server, we can run the server for years and there's not much else cost-wise, but there's still your infrastructure costs on water, electricity, your server hosting costs in terms of your data centers, your actual operational costs. So there's a lot of additional costs. So if you start looking at cloud and you start looking at SaaS services or PaaS services, the cost of cloud could be more competitive than your on-premise.
And Craig, where would such a misconception originate from? Just because we've got moved to the cloud, then
a lot of people tend to like to go straight to infrastructure as a service. So they tend to go, I've got these servers right here. Now I'm going to move those to the cloud. I'm not going to re-engineer them. I'm not going to do anything with them. I'm just going to move them there.
Yeah.
And that is a very costly exercise because you're not making use of your cloud services. You're not making use of where you can potentially save. You're not making use of any of those. And then in terms of obviously the security side, in terms of why everyone just thinks it's more secure, is there's this false conception of if I move it to the cloud, it is someone else's problem.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's not my problem. Therefore, I'm more secure because, Microsoft is a big conglomerate that has massive amounts to spend on security. So obviously it must be more secure. But your configuration issues become a big problem, and they're easy to do. It's if you deploy in a Microsoft cloud, for example, by default, it's actually insecure. They're moving away from it. They're changing that. So, for example, if I want to spin up a VM in Microsoft, by default, it gets a public IP. So by default, it's already on the internet. Yeah. It's already there. And then usually you have RDP open to the internet. So those are things that obviously the attackers are scanning. Yeah. They have the public IP addresses of all the clouds. Those are published by the cloud because obviously if you want to enable communication from your on-prem to cloud, you have to open that up on firewalls. So you need to know IP address ranges. And because those are exposed, attackers have. So
attackers always...
yeah, they're always a step ahead is the challenge, yes.
And Craig, if we look at, like a breach in terms of a cloud service provider is breached you, what are some of the real business consequences that, let's say, we'll have to...
It depends on the level of breach. Okay. It also depends on what is breached from the cloud service provider. So a lot of the cloud service providers have segmented environments. So if their corporate environment is compromised, the risk on your cloud environment is quite minimal. But obviously, if their cloud environment is compromised, then obviously there's a potential for exposure of your data.
Yeah.
And the way you can mitigate that is there's configurations, again, that you can potentially do. So you can enable encryption. You can bring your own key, so you're not using the provider's key. And that then allows you to have at least some protections against. Obviously, they're going to get the encrypted data, but hopefully your key is strong enough that they can't crack it very quickly. Or when they do eventually crack it, hopefully the data that they have is no longer of relevance or importance.
Okay. And Craig, from like you as, and being a head of IT and, what would you say are some of the most significant cloud-related threats that you currently focused on?
So there's not really such a thing as a cloud threat.
Okay.
The threat landscape is similar on cloud versus on-premise. There's obviously things that are more prevalent in cloud and where they attack mostly in cloud. So your main threats are going to come from your users. Oh. And that's on-prem, that's cloud. That's no matter where you go, you're always going to have the user threat.
Is it that whole thing that your weakest link is the user?
It's always because ultimately you put security around and your users are in the environment direct. And your protections obviously cater for your users being able to do their job.
Yeah.
It's much like most people have said is if you want to be secure, you would need to turn off the machine and go lock it in the safe and then you'd be 100% secure. The problem is your users need to be able to do their job, which means they need to have access, means they need to get to places, which obviously means they become your biggest threat. Because they're also the ones that obviously is cheap to send tons of phishing emails. And you just need to catch one. And you make your money back in terms of if you're a threat actor. So that's your biggest risk. And that's biggest risk, cloud, on-prem, doesn't matter. The second one would be that configuration, which is obviously the main one that a lot of people miss.
Yeah.
Because out of your breaches for cloud, your config is quite a major one. Your users is a major one. And then the rest is the same as on-prem. It's your vulnerabilities. It's the usual suspects. But out of that, I'd say most probably 70% is your users. Probably the 20% is your configurations. Because trust me, they scan that environment continuously, looking for the vulnerabilities, looking for misconfigurations. If you had to, for example, put a actual server up in a cloud environment and you left RDP open, you're most probably looking at about 3 hours, maybe even less, that server will have been breached.
Yeah.
So they're very quick, and AI is playing a big role in this.
Can you talk to us about that? Like just the role of AI, what is it?
Yeah, so AI obviously helps us from a defense perspective. It's just our AI is kind of behind the ones that the threat actors are actually using.
That's so ironic.
And that's the challenge is we're always on the back foot. We're always trying to play catch up to them. We have to defend 1 million entry points. They have to find one weakness. It's a numbers game. So that they're always going to be able to. There's always a risk of someone's going to get into your environment. And as IT professionals and security professionals, obviously our usual saying is it's not about if, it's about when. And it's about how do you mitigate what happens when that when happens.
It's also, I think that I've heard something along the lines of that you mustn't think that you are, just because you've got the necessary protections and the necessary guardrails, you are protected. Like you just have to be prepared for.
You have to assume a breach, yes. You have to go and assume the breach and put in the necessary protections to mitigate how far that actual breach spreads. So protect it down to just that endpoint gets breached and nothing else gets breached. And that's where the challenge is. And as everyone knows, cybersecurity is not an easy thing to do. It is quite a challenge.
You guys up at night?
Well, especially with the AI. Especially with the users being the primary concern and AI being on the rise and the ability of AI to fake people. That is most probably the one thing that does keep me up at night and makes me worried is the video phishing and the voice phishing. So phishing, as they like to term it, that is very prevalent or gonna be more prevalent, I would say, with the AI. Because now if your boss is phoning you, it's very difficult for you as the individual to go, hey, no, I'm not trusting you. And that is a very big challenge that we do need to overcome.
That's
I don't know how, but that is a big challenge.
And just we know that there's a skill shortage, Craig, and just to hear from you, just maybe as our final point in terms of how South African organizations are prepared for, in terms of the talent and the skills perspective to manage some of these growing threats and evolution of threats with with AI becoming so much more prevalent.
It's a very big challenge. There is a lack of skills globally, not just South Africa. The challenge is also a lot of our businesses tend to be more on the older side on how our tech is structured. So it's very difficult for a new intern or something to come into a lot of businesses and start learning and going into the future stuff, the cloud stuff. Because a lot of the businesses aren't there yet. A lot are still on-prem. A lot are still very protective over the perimeter. A lot haven't even moved to the endpoint being the actual protections. COVID changed a lot of that. So it forced a lot of the migration to start going, your perimeter is not sufficient. Your endpoints are where you need to protect. And that started that shift. The cloud shift it's a slow shift, especially from a regulational perspective. People worried about POPIA and where do you put it in cloud? Where do you actually, what is protected? What's not protected? Not knowing what the differences in terms of the services are. That becomes your challenges. So it's very difficult for an intern to get skilled up in this. And we have a very big shortage of interns. Well, even of senior experienced individuals because they don't have that experience yet.
Quite a bleak picture, but
police, unfortunately.
Craig, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for chatting to us. That was Craig Lindsay. He is the head of IT and IT consulting at Bidvest Advisory Services.